There's a story Rome chose to tell as a glorious triumph, but in reality, it was something far colder, more calculated, and more unsettling than any military epic could capture. In 101 BC, on a dusty plain in northern Italy, an army of more than 120,000 warriors was destroyed in a matter of hours, not by magic, not by luck, not by the superior bravery of Roman soldiers, but by a mind that had turned the sun, the wind, and the dust into weapons as deadly as any blade. If you still believe that the great battles of history were won through brute force, what you're about to discover will completely change the way you see power, strategy, and victory. Most people know Rome for its grandeur, the Colosseums, the emperors, the legions marching in perfect formation. But there's a layer of Roman history that rarely appears in textbooks, the layer where generals thought like scientists, where battles were designed with the precision of controlled experiments, and where the true battlefield wasn't the terrain, it was the commander's mind. Gaius Marius was that kind of man, and Vercellae was his masterpiece. A battle that didn't begin when the armies met, but weeks earlier, when Marius chose where the sun would rise over the field, from which direction the wind would blow, and how much heat a Cimbrian warrior could endure before beginning to make fatal mistakes. What makes this story truly fascinating and unsettling is that it isn't just about Rome. It's about how controlling invisible variables determines outcomes in any arena, in any era. The principles Marius applied in 101 BC are the same ones used by the world's best strategists, negotiators, and leaders today, often without even realizing they're repeating a lesson that is over 2,000 years old. You're about to understand not just how Rome destroyed the Cimbri, but why this specific victory changed the course of Western history in ways we still feel today. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. And if you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Now sit back, because this story is about to begin. Between 113 and 101 BC, Rome found itself facing something its generals had never clearly encountered before, an enemy that did not play by the rules. The Cimbri were not a conventional army marching along predictable routes with fixed bases. They were an entire migration turned into a force of war, a moving mass of people sweeping across Europe like a flood that refused to stay within its banks. Entire tribes, women, children, elders, and warriors advanced without traditional supply lines, living off whatever they could seize along the way. Rome, accustomed to fighting structured enemies it could attack, besiege, and defeat, suddenly found itself trying to hold sand in its hands, and the sand kept slipping through its fingers. The result of this strategic misunderstanding was devastating. Roman legions trained for predictable battles within known tactical frameworks simply could not adapt their methods to such a fluid and unpredictable enemy. And then came Arausio, a battle that would remain etched as an open wound in Rome's collective memory. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers are believed to have been killed in a single day, in a defeat so catastrophic that it was not just military, it was psychological. On that field, Rome lost not only men, but something far harder to replace, the conviction of its own invincibility. The moral collapse that followed sparked political panic, a leadership crisis, and a fear that spread through the streets of the capital like a silent, devastating rumor. This is a point few people truly examine in depth. The real danger of Arausio wasn't the number of casualties, but the collapse of the narrative of superiority that sustained Rome. A civilization functions, in large part, on a shared belief in its own strength, and when that belief cracks, everything trembles with it. At that moment, Rome was staring into an internal abyss as much as an external one, and it was precisely in this scenario of systemic crisis, a system beginning to fracture from within, that a name began to gain weight and urgency in the corridors of power. And it was precisely in this chaos, in this Rome bleeding from within, that one man saw what no one else could. Gaius Marius was not the kind of general Rome usually celebrated. He didn't come from a noble family, didn't have the right name, didn't move in the right circles, and that may have been exactly why he was able to see what others could not. While the Roman elite debated in the Senate and pointed fingers, Marius looked at the problem with surgical clarity and reached a conclusion few dared to admit. The problem wasn't the enemy, it was Rome's own military system. An entire structure built on fragile foundations, dependent on temporary citizen soldiers with no continuous training and no lasting connection to military life, men who served for a season and then returned to their farms. The impact was immediate and profound. Discipline increased, coordination between units improved dramatically, and perhaps the most underestimated gain of all, the psychological resilience of the soldiers became vastly stronger. An army that fights because it chooses to is fundamentally different from one that fights because it must. There's a powerful lesson here that goes far beyond the battlefields of antiquity. Marius understood that before changing outcomes, you must change the system that produces them. It's not enough to train harder within a broken structure. The structure itself must be rebuilt. This mindset appears in the greatest turning points in history, in military campaigns that shifted from temporary recruits to specialized standing forces, in civilizations that realized culture outperforms isolated talent. Rome was about to reap the rewards of this transformation, but first it had to wait for the right moment. And Marius, unlike everyone else, knew exactly how to wait. The army had been reformed, the men were ready, and the Cimbri, without realizing it, were walking straight into a trap that hadn't even been fully set yet. When the Cimbri finally crossed the Alps and entered Italy, they carried an almost arrogant confidence. After all, they were the same people who had repeatedly crushed Roman armies, who had humiliated Rome at Arausio, who had marched across half of Europe without truly being stopped. Their plan was simple: enter Italy, join forces with the Teutones, another Germanic group advancing through southern Gaul, and then march on Rome in a coordinated, devastating movement. What they didn't know was that the Teutones no longer existed. Marius had already destroyed them at the Battle of Aquae Sextia, and the Cimbri were waiting for reinforcements that were already dead. That moment of ignorance cost the Cimbri something precious and irrecoverable: time. And in the hands of Gaius Marius, time was a weapon as lethal as any sword. While the Cimbri waited, reorganized, and tried to understand what had happened to their allies, Marius moved with deliberate, calculated calm. He chose the battlefield, studied the environmental conditions, positioned his troops, and rehearsed movements. Every decision made not in the heat of urgency, but with the cold precision of someone who already knew how the story would end. For the first time in that cycle of wars, Rome controlled the variables. It controlled time, space, and the tempo of the conflict. There is something deeply strategic in this phase that deserves attention. Marius didn't rush to attack, he waited, and that waiting was not passivity, it was control. The greatest strategists in history, from Sun Tzu to Rome's finest generals, taught the same principle. A battle is won before it begins, in the moment you decide where, when, and how it will take place. The Cimbri believed they were preparing for war. In reality, they were already losing one. And when the two armies finally faced each other on the plains near Vercellae, what seemed like a meeting of warriors was truly something far colder, far more calculated, and far more lethal than either side could imagine. But what happened on the plains of Vercellae that day was not a battle, it was a scientific experiment, and the Cimbri were the subject. What makes an ordinary general from a military genius isn't courage, it's the ability to turn the battlefield into a laboratory. And that's exactly what Gaius Marius did at Vercellae. While most commanders of the time thought in terms of men versus men, swords versus shields, Marius thought in variables. He didn't just choose the location of the battle, he chose the timing, the direction of advance, and the environmental conditions that would favor his troops while undermining the enemy. It was summer. The morning sun rose in the east, the wind blew towards the Cimbri, and the dry ground ensured that any large movement would kick up massive clouds of dust. None of these elements were coincidence, they were decisions. The positioning relative to the sun was perhaps the most elegant detail of the entire operation. Marius placed his legions with their backs to the rising sun, meaning the Romans could see the battlefield clearly, while the Cimbri advanced with the sun directly in their eyes, a partial blindness that compromised depth perception, movement recognition, and coordination between units. Add to that the dust stirred up by tens of thousands of men advancing across dry terrain, and you have a growing curtain of chaos forming on the Germanic side of the field. Communication among Cimbrian leaders broke, and when all those variables began to act at once, what had been an army of feared warriors started to dissolve, not all at once, but in stages, like a structure losing one bolt at a time until it completely collapses. The collapse of an army rarely happens instantly. It follows an almost biological logic, a sequence of deterioration that, once set in motion, becomes impossible to reverse. At Vercellae, that sequence was precise and relentless. First came disorganization. The Cimbri formations, already compromised by dust and sunlight, began to lose cohesion. Warriors at the front could no longer clearly see what lay ahead, while those behind lost visual contact with their leaders. Order, the oxygen of any army, began to fade, and without order, what had been a coordinated force quickly became a confused mass of men reacting on instinct. That was the moment the Roman execution came into play with near mechanical precision. The center of the Roman line, commanded by Catulus, held firm, absorbing the frontal impact of the Cimbri without retreating, acting as an anvil that kept the enemy fixed in place. Meanwhile, Marius closed the flanks in a pincer movement that cut off any possibility of retreat or reorganization. The enemy cavalry, which could have shifted the tide, was neutralized before it could fulfill its role. The trap was closing with the precision of someone who wasn't improvising but executing a plan conceived long before that day. Every Roman movement followed a script. Every Cimbri reaction fed the trap. When panic came, it came like a wave that made no distinction between the brave and the fearful. Warriors who had crushed Roman armies years before now found themselves surrounded, gasping in the heat, disoriented by dust, unable to identify where the danger was or where the next blow would come from. And that's where the most brutal lesson of Vercellae lies. Panic is not a failure of character. It is the natural response of any human being placed in an environment that has become completely uncontrollable. Marius did not win because his soldiers were braver. He won because he made the Cimbri's environment unbearable while keeping his own men's conditions under total control. What followed next would no longer resemble a battle. It would be something entirely different. Because when panic takes hold of an army, the battle ends and something else begins, something history records with a far heavier word: annihilation. The word annihilation carries a weight that goes beyond the number of dead. It describes a process of erasure, not just of lives, but of an entire threat, a force that had terrified a civilization for over a decade. At Vercellae, that process unfolded over hours. The Cimbri who tried to flee found the Roman flanks closed. Those who attempted to regroup lacked the communication needed to do so. And those who fought to the end faced legions that, unlike them, still had energy, clear visibility, and functioning command structures. Ancient sources speak of roughly 120,000 dead, a number that, even accounting for exaggeration, points to destruction on a scale that even Rome struggled to comprehend. There was no longer a Cimbrian army. There was only a field covered with silence. The silence that followed the battle was of a particular kind, the kind that comes when something that once existed with overwhelming force simply ceases to exist. Around 60,000 surviving Cimbri were enslaved, a fate that, in Roman logic, was almost a mercy compared to what had befallen their companions. For Rome, that field marked the end of a nightmare that had lasted for more than a generation. The threat that had destroyed armies, crossed Europe, and shaken the Roman Senate had been eliminated with near surgical efficiency. Gaius Marius would return to Rome not just as a victorious general, but as a savior, the man who restored what Arausio had taken, Rome's belief in its own invincibility. And here lies a detail few notice when studying Vercellae. The magnitude of the victory was not just in the numbers, but in what it represented psychologically for an entire civilization. Rome had been cured of a trauma. And traumas resolved in such dramatic and definitive ways don't just restore confidence, they amplify it. The Rome that emerged from Vercellae was more confident, more militarized, and far more aware of what a professional, well-commanded army could truly wield. But every cure has side effects, and the consequences of this victory were about to reshape Rome in ways no one anticipated. Because great victories never end on the battlefield, they continue through economies, institutions, and power structures, and sometimes what looks like absolute triumph carries within it the seeds of a future crisis. The first impact of Vercellae was economic, and it was felt in a way most ordinary Romans had not anticipated. 60,000 enslaved Cimbri flooded the Roman labor market all at once, driving down the value of work and making free labor increasingly uncompetitive. The small rural farmer, already squeezed by decades of instability and war, now faced an impossible challenge. How do you compete with large estates run by dozens of slaves with no wages to pay? The result was a silent rural exodus toward the cities, urban swelling that created a mass of citizens without land, without stable income, and without prospects. A population like that, as history consistently shows, is the perfect fuel for political instability. A military victory had, unintentionally, created a social crisis. On the military level, the consolidation of Marius's professional model had consequences that went far beyond battlefield efficiency. A permanent professional army does not fight for the republic. It fights for the general who feeds it, pays it, and leads it. The bond between soldier and commander became stronger than the bond between soldier and the state. This may sound like a minor administrative shift, but it was one of the deepest and most irreversible transformations in Roman history. When a powerful general decides that his personal interests outweigh the laws of the republic, he now has an entire army at his side that thinks the same way. Rome had created, in order to save itself, the very structure that would eventually undermine it from within. And this is where the story of Vercellae becomes more than a military episode. It becomes a case study on how short-term solutions shape the long-term in ways no one can see at the moment decisions are made. Marius's reforms were necessary, brilliant even, but they paved the way for Sulla, for Caesar, for Augustus, for the end of the Republic and the transition to empire. Rome was not destroyed by barbarians. It was transformed, slowly and inevitably, by the consequences of the very choices it made to survive. And all of it, this entire chain of cause and effect that reshaped the Western world, began with a lesson Marius applied on a dusty field by the Sesia River on a summer morning in 101 BC. And it's precisely at this point, when you step back and look at everything Vercellae produced, the silence of the battlefield, the economic transformation, the political rupture, that an unavoidable question emerges. What was Vercellae really? Vercellae was not just a battle, It was a turning point that ended more than a decade of terror, restored Rome's belief in its own strength, and permanently buried the people who had humiliated the legions at Arausio. In a single day, on a dusty field in northern Italy, Gaius Marius erased a threat that had crossed all of Europe without being stopped. The Cimbri, who had destroyed armies, crossed mountains, and shaken the Roman Senate, ceased to exist as a military force within hours, and Rome, which had bled for more than a decade, emerged from that field transformed, more confident, more militarized, and far more aware of what a professional, well-commanded army could truly wield. But what makes Vercellae truly fascinating is the layer beneath the victory. Because Rome did not win that battle on the day the armies met, it won weeks earlier when Marius chose the terrain, studied the sun, calculated the wind, and designed every variable with the cold precision of an architect. The Cimbri arrived at the battlefield already defeated, without knowing it. And that's the dimension of Vercellae that official history rarely explores with the depth it deserves. That Rome's greatest general was not the one who fought best, but the one who made the fight unnecessary before it even began. And Rome went on, but it was not the same. The seeds planted at Vercellae, the professional army, the dependence of soldiers on their generals, and the influx of enslaved people that reshaped the economy, grew quietly until they blossomed into conflicts that would redefine the ancient world. Can you imagine what those conflicts were? Which generals rose after Marius, carrying forward the very model he created? Let me know your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next stories dive exactly into those answers, each one